Today I'm going to be looking at a video of All right, Milton Friedman on the Great Depression. Let's get into it.
Wall Street. Most of us know what happened here 50 years ago. Inside the stock exchange, on October 29, 1929, the market collapsed. It came to be known as Black Thursday. The Wall Street crash was followed by the worst depression in American history. That depression has been blamed on the failure of capitalism. It was no such thing, but the myth lives on. What happened was very different. Although things looked healthy on the surface, business had begun to turn down in mid-1929. The crash intensified the recession. So did continuing bank failures in the South and Midwest. But the recession only became a crisis when these failures spread to New York, and in particular to this building, then the headquarters of the Bank of the United States. Far-reaching effects, and it need never have happened. It was something of a historical accident that this particular bank played the role it did. Why did it fail? It was a perfectly good bank. Banks that were in far worse financial shape had come under difficulties before it did, and had, through the cooperation of other banks, been saved. The reason why it wasn't saved has to do with its rather special character. First, its name, Bank of United States, a name that made immigrants believe it was an official governmental bank, although in fact it was an ordinary commercial bank. Second, its ownership, Jewish. Both its name and the character of its ownership, which had so much to do with attracting a large number of depositors from the many Jewish businessmen in the city of New York. Both of them also had the effect of alienating other bankers who did not like the special advantage of the name and did not like the character of the ownership. As a result, other banks were all too ready to spread rumors, to help promote an atmosphere.
The reason why bank runs occur is because banks are fundamentally bankrupt. Their liabilities are due immediately, demand deposits. Their assets are due in the future, when loans come due. So, they're bankrupt. That's why banks can and do experience bank runs. So the solution would be to have, instead of having demand deposits where customers can pull their money out at any time, you would lend the money to the bank for a month or a year, and then the bank would lend the money out for a year, like that. Or separate entirely the better solution is to separate entirely the process of the warehousing of money and investment banking. Let investment bankers use capital they raise for investments, and then consumers can just pay banks to hold on to their cash for them. What we have is a system of fractional reserve banking. So you deposit $1,000 in the bank, they hold on to $100, and they lend out $900. But this is inflationary because with that $900 that's lent out, the person who buys it, who borrows it, is going to spend it on equipment or whatever for their business, and that's going to go into the receivable for the business they spend the money at. They're going to take that deposit into the bank, and now you've got $1,000 demand deposit for you, and then they've put $1,000 in their account, so now there's an extra $1,000 in the money supply. So this process, especially of commercial loans, expands the money supply. And this is a problem, especially when you're under a gold standard, because there's no corresponding increase of gold. This new money's not backed by gold. You're basically going off the gold standard when you have fractional reserve banking. Or you're switching to a partial gold standard where only some of the money supply is backed by gold. Now, a gold standard is important because it means that you have a stable money supply. You don't increase it, it's fixed. Or if you increase it, you buy gold to back it. So the point is there would be no inflation. every year we have inflation. Right now it's 3%, it was 7%. And this is because the government keeps increasing the money supply, so your money becomes worth less. The government likes it because they get to literally print money or figuratively print money. They're doing it through checking accounts and electronics. You know, it's not literally printing it. But so the central bank, in the Federal Reserve's case, they create money out of thin air. They use that money to buy government bonds from commercial banks, and at the end of the year, they return any profits to the government.
Which runs got started on the bank in which it came into difficulty. And they were less than usually willing to cooperate in the efforts that were made to save it. Only a few blocks away is the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. It was here that the Bank of the United States could have been saved. Indeed, the Federal Reserve System had been set up 17 years earlier, precisely to prevent the worst consequences of bank failures. The Federal Reserve Bank of New York, whose directors today meet in this room, devised a plan in cooperation.
That's basically true. The Federal Reserve was set up to prevent bank failures. Basically, this counterfeiting of money, this creation of money, could not occur without the cartelization of the banking system that the Federal Reserve represents. So, what used to happen is banks would issue bank notes, and those bank notes were supposed to be backed by gold. The bank notes would then be spent like money, and the people who received them would send them to their bank. That bank would ask the other bank for redemption in the form of specie, gold. And if a bank tried to use fractional reserve banking in the system, create more bank notes than they had gold, then they would quickly go bankrupt because they would be called upon for redemption in specie. In fact, this happened. So, for example, in the War of 1812, the government needed money to fight their war, so they turned to these new banks that were being set up at the time, unincorporated private banks, some illegal under state law, and these banks would issue fractional reserve notes to the government. So they would have $1 million in gold, but they would issue $3 million in banknotes to the government. The government would then spend those banknotes in New England on manufactured goods that they needed for the war effort. And eventually, the New England banks were much more conservative, and they were not using fractional reserves. They were using full reserves at the time. So they called upon redemption of these banknotes. Of course, they couldn't be redeemed because they didn't have the gold. They only had a third the gold. So what happened was the government stepped in and said these banks could suspend specie payment, but could continue collecting on their liabilities and operate. So they were in the privileged position of not having to make good on their debts, but they could collect debts that other people owed them. And eventually they were able to stay solvent. So the point being that any bank that practices fractional reserves is inherently bankrupt and will quickly be exposed as such on the free market unless you have a system of cartelizing the money supply, cartelizing banknotes, a la the Federal Reserve, that allows all the banks to sort of expand the money supply harmoniously in lockstep. And because everybody's just using Federal Reserve notes, a la the US dollar, then there's no redemption for specie. There is no specie. They're just using paper money, and there's nothing to stop the inflation. So it really is a scam by which bankers can enrich themselves at the expense of the general public.
Superintendent of Banking of the State of New York to save the Bank of the United States. Their plan called for merging the Bank of the United States with...
So Friedman's point is that the government didn't do enough, that the Federal Reserve should have stepped in as the lender of last resort and held the whole banking system together, when in reality, they should have just let the bank runs continue and allow the banks to be exposed as bankrupt, to smash the whole fractional reserve system and return to a gold standard and free banking. Technically, there was a gold standard in place at this point. However, it wasn't being followed because there was a great expansion of money in the form of business credit, massive increase in the money supply in the 1920s in the lead up to the Great Depression. That was the whole problem. That's why there was a Great Depression, because this credit expansion led to a misallocation of resources, malinvestment in capital goods industries. Ultimately, it was liquidated. That was the bust. And then the problem was from there that Hoover and then FDR tried to intervene in the economy to solve the Depression, which just made matters worse.
And also providing a guarantee fund to be subscribed to by still other bankers to assure the depositors that the assets of the Bank of the United States were safe and sound. The Reserve Bank called meeting after meeting to try to put the plan into effect. It was on again, off again. But finally, after an all-night meeting on December 10th, 1930, the other bankers, including in particular John Pierpont Morgan, refused to subscribe to the guarantee fund, and the plan was off. The next day, the Bank of the United States closed its doors, never again to open for business. For its depositors, who saw their savings tied up and their businesses destroyed, the closing was tragic. Yet when the bank was finally liquidated, in the worst years of the Depression, it paid back 92.5 cents on the dollar. Had the other banks cooperated to save it, no one would have lost a penny. For the other...
What that shows to me is that the Great Depression wasn't actually that serious, that things would have been fine had the government left well enough alone. If you look at what happened 10 years earlier, 1920, 1921, during the recession that nobody's ever heard of, Harding did very little. He just cut taxes and sort of got out of the way, let the market fix itself, and that recession ended quite quickly. But it was Hoover and FDR's policies of intervention, of trying to keep wages high when they needed to go low to correct the unemployment, that really prolonged the situation and made it so much worse.
They thought that closing the Bank of the United States would have purely local effects. They were wrong. Partly because it had so many depositors. Partly because so many of the depositors were small businessmen. Partly because it was the largest bank that had ever been permitted to fail in the United States up to this time. The effects were far-reaching. Depositors all over the country were frightened about the safety of their funds and rushed to withdraw them. Failures of banks by the droves. And all the time, the Federal Reserve System stood idly by when it had the power and the duty and the responsibility to provide the cash that would have enabled the banks to meet the insistent demands of depositors without closing their doors. The way runs on banks can spread and can be stopped is a consequence of the way our banking system works. You may.
Runs on banks shouldn't be stopped. They expose the fundamental flaw in fractional reserve banking, that the banks are bankrupt, they don't have the money, it's not there. The whole thing's a scam, and it's a good thing when bank runs happen because they expose how the system is fraudulent. So what you should have is a system of free banking, gold standard, no fractional reserve banking, separate the warehousing of funds and investment banking, and have a stable, non-inflationary money supply. That's the formula for real long-term economic growth. It all comes down to the money supply. Not only that, but the gold standard is a powerful check on imperialism, because in order to wage wars of aggression, you need to debase the money supply.